Okay, so now that we have watched the intro video and we've done the prior knowledge quiz and we've thought a little bit about why this topic is important and relevant to our own lives, we'll delve into some more details now about writing about scientific results. So we'll talk about the meat of that next. Okay, and so just to recap a little bit about why writing about scientific results is so important. One of the reasons why is because this is a skill that's desired by employers. So if you look at this list here, we're showing skills that are desired by employers, right? So number one, the first one we have here is communication, both written and oral. And so we're going to focus on the written part today. We also have listed next critical thinking and then information literacy. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about information literacy, what it means, and how to accomplish it, and how some of the modules within this course are going to help you accomplish that. But again, what we're going to focus on today is communication, specifically written communication. And it's important to have an explicit focus on building you as students' scientific writing abilities, because they've actually done studies to show that your scientific writing can actually improve your critical thinking. So there's this feedback here where both the written communication and critical thinking can interact with each other, and the scientific writing can actually help improve your critical thinking. And then just to think again about how developing these effective scientific writing skills will prepare you for your desired career. Hopefully you thought a little bit about this already with the quiz, but essentially what I did here is just Google Sacramento biology jobs. And these are 3 examples that I found right here. So these are all current listings as of July 2019. But if we look here, and I recognize that even though you're all biology majors, you can have different career goals. So I tried to pick a variety of things here. But if we look at the first one here, molecular biology scientist for Thermo Fisher, you've probably used a lot of their kits in your lab classes. But if we look at the skills that they want, they're wanting excellent verbal and written communication skills. In terms of job duties for this scientist, writing up experiments is one of the job duties, so that will require scientific writing skills. The second one listed there is laboratory technician. Again, if you look at job duties, those include communicating the results of tests and analyses. That likely includes written communication. And then lastly, we have here wildlife biologist for an environmental consulting company. And if you look at qualifications that are listed there, that particular company wants extensive experience in document writing, again, scientific writing. And for skills, they want exceptional written communication skills. So developing the ability to effectively write about scientific results and have these scientific writing skills is really important for your future career in whatever related trajectory you choose to take. Even if you branch a little bit outside of biology, these writing skills are still really important and vital to your future success. So that's why we're focusing on it here in BIO100. And so what we're going to talk about when we talk about the results section, specifically here, we'll talk about 2 main components of any given paragraph that you'll find in a results section in a scientific paper, or even in a lab report if you want to think about maybe something you've already written in your lab classes. And so these 2 main components that we're going to talk about, I'm going to call the where and the what. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what each of those different aspects are within a result section. So here I'm just writing that out. The where is in general which figure or table the data are shown in. And then the what is fully describing the actual results of the experiment. And so I like to point out here, this says experiment. Not everything you're going to read and not everything that's done in science is actually a manipulative experiment. So that could be Also, describing the results of some kind of study or some kind of descriptive study that doesn't necessarily involve you changing things or manipulating variables for an actual experiment. But those are the two main things: the where, so where is the data shown in a figure or a table, and then what, describing the actual results. So we're going to walk through two different examples from scientific papers to help illustrate these two different components, the where and the what. And so the first one we're going to walk through is actually an example from a paper that I published during my PhD work in grad school. And so just for a little bit of background on this study, what I focused on here is looking at northern versus southern California populations of an intertidal marine snail. So if we want to be a little artistic and creative here, we'll just pretend that those are our little snails. And we're focusing on different populations in northern versus southern California. So, nope. Trying to draw California. It's not going well. Okay, let's pretend that is California. So here are the sites that we're talking about. We're talking about 3 populations of Northern California. So we'll do those in blue. So generally those 3 sites are around San Francisco. And then we have 3 in Southern California. Those are going to be down here around San Diego. So just to give you an idea of what data we're talking about. And so one of the main things that this paper was looking at differences in survival after you take these snails from these 2 different populations, expose them to high temperatures, that's what we call heat stress, and then see whether some individuals from different populations survive better than other ones. So that's the general background for this results section we're going to be looking at here to examine these different components. So first of all, in general, again, the what is giving us information about the number of the table or the figure that shows the experimental data. And so these can be either at the beginning or the end of a sentence when you're writing it out, and we'll show examples of both of those ways of doing it. And another important point to make here is that you want to give the exact number of the figure or table, including panel if appropriate. So what that means is you may have seen figures before that look like this. So here's our figure. And within that figure, they actually have what are called different panels. So this might be A, B, C, or D. And in each of those panels, you're showing different graphs, for instance. That's a regression, and here we have 3 groups. So the idea here where it says give the exact number of the figure or table, you wouldn't just say, as you can see in figure 1, but you'd really want to be more specific and say, for instance, as you can see in figure 1A, and then that'll cue the reader to where specifically they should be looking within that figure in which of the panels. So that's what we mean by panels, different panels of the figure. Okay. So here is an example drawn from that paper where we were looking at the different survival of the snails. And so this is an example here where this sentence is saying the largest difference between northern and southern populations occurred at 39 degrees C. So this is, again, we're looking at that heat stress. But the idea here is this is an example of how in this sentence we are indicating that the data related to this statement is shown in figure 3 of the paper, so the reader knows where to find this information. So that's an example of where, so how you would show where the data is. And then the second component that we said, there's a where and then there's a what. And so the what is fully describing all aspects of the data that are shown in that respective figure or table. So for the example we just talked about, that would be in figure 3. And then what it does is it describes the full range of observations that can be drawn from the data. And what I mean by that is I'll show an example, but you wouldn't just say, for instance, the populations are different. So here if we're talking about, again, northern versus southern snails, you wouldn't just say they're different, you'd want to describe how they're different, right? So that's what I mean by the full range of observations. And then the third thing here, in your results section, you also want to describe the statistical tests you use to analyze your results. So we've talked about t-tests, which is again for 2 groups, right? And we've talked about ANOVA last week, and so that's for 3 groups. So when you're writing up the result section for a scientific paper, you want to make sure to include this information about what statistical tests you used. Okay, so here is, again, drawing from that same paper. This is figure 3 that was mentioned previously. So I'll walk us through this figure just so we know what's happening here. But this is just an example to show you so we can talk about the different components, the full range of observations that should be listed for a scientific results section. So here on the x-axis, we have temperature. So these are the different temperatures that the snails were exposed to. And then on the y-axis here, we have the percent survival. So basically, for each of these temperatures, what was the percentage of the snails that survived being exposed to that temperature? And then we're looking at those 3 populations in Southern California, and then the 3 populations in Northern California. So that's all shown here on figure 3, which was already referenced. So next we'll talk about how you would describe this data fully. So here, this is again an excerpt from that paper. So what we said was southern populations show significantly higher survival at 38, 39, and 40 degrees C. So remember, we had these multiple temperatures, right? And so this is describing not only which population showed higher survival, but also at which of those temperatures it happened at. Then it goes on to talk about the largest differences between populations and which temperature that occurred at. So, and then it elaborates saying that the southern populations show 90% survival, while the northern populations only show 61% survival. So again, this is an example of how to describe the full range of observations that you can pull from that single figure. So you can, all of this text here is describing that single figure, but there's a lot of information to extract there. And so when you're writing these result sections, you want to make sure you're describing all of the data that's being contained. And then they also talk about then, so here we're at this point here, so talking about although all populations show a decline in survival when you increase the heat stress, the decline for the southern populations is less severe. So remember, we're looking at the general trend that looks like this for the southern populations, whereas here for the northern populations, that decline they're talking about is sharper. So you see a sharper drop off here. And so they're again describing specifically how at 40 degrees, the survival is different between the populations. And so everything that we were looking at here is comparing the north versus the southern populations, okay? And so remember, we want to talk about the full range of observations from the data. So here we're talking about all 6 populations. And so this is describing differences among those 6 populations, in addition to different patterns between Northern and Southern California. So all of this is just an example to show you that when you're writing result sections, you want to make sure you tell your reader where that data is contained. So what figure or what table can they find that information in? And then when you're describing it in text, you want to give a full description of the data that's being shown in those figures. And then I want to go through one more example to illustrate, again, the where and the what of these results components. And this time we're going to return to the fish egg data set that we used previously. So here, this is a lot easier for me to draw. That's my fish egg. Okay, so if you need a refresher about what this data set is, you can watch that previously posted video on Canvas. And so specifically here for this result section, we're going to look at a particular part of the paper that focused on whether the number of eggs collected was different depending on the water temperature, whether it was above or below a certain temperature. So for this example, here we're looking first at an example of the where. So if you were reading this paper, how would you know where to find the data corresponding to this text? And so the first example here is showing us an example of how to put that information at the end of the sentence. So remember, we said you can put it either at the beginning or the end. And so this first sentence here is an example, oops, nope, that's not right, of putting it at the end. Okay, and then if you look at the second bullet point there, this sentence here, table in S1, blah, 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 that's an example of putting it at the beginning. And so just a quick note here, if you're reading a paper and it says figure S1 or table S1, the S stands for supplementary. And so what that means is it's a figure, or in this case, a table that's not contained within the main body or the main text of the paper. But if you look online, for instance, where that paper is published, there will be additional supplementary tables or figures. So it's additional information that, for whatever reason, they couldn't include in the actual text of the paper. For a lot of journals have limits to how many figures or tables you can include. So that's what that means, S1. The main point here, this is an example of how you can indicate where that data is, also at the beginning of the sentence. And this is the figure 5 that we're going to be talking about in the next slide to show the different written part of the results. So again, describing that data in full. And this is another example here where for a figure, we have two different panels, right? We have A and B. So the difference between these two panels, the axes are the same for both. So if you look at the x-axis, we have temperature. So either below or above a certain temperature. The cutoffs are the same for both. The y-axes are also the same. We're looking at the number of eggs collected. But the difference here, if you look at the legend for the figure 5A, so panel A, is showing from all species, all fish egg species, and then panel B is specifically for anchovy eggs, okay? So this is an example of how you want to be specific when you're referring to a figure, whether you're talking about panel A or panel B. And so this is the text example corresponding to that same figure. And what the text is saying is that the mean temperature across all collections was 17.8 degrees. We then determined the average number of eggs per collection when water temperature was either above or below this mean. And then they explain why they separated out the anchovy. And here again, remember we said that when you're doing the what part and explaining your results, you always want to make sure you include the statistical tests, right? And so here we have a really good example of that. So the authors explain that they used an unpaired t-test and found more total eggs when the temperatures were above the mean. And here they included their test statistic and their p-value. And so because that p-value is less than 0.05, that means it's significant. Whereas in contrast, when they're talking just about the anchovy eggs, so remember that was panel B of the figure, they found the opposite pattern. They found fewer eggs when temperatures were above the mean. Again, they have their test statistic and their p-value. So this is another example of how when you're talking about the full range of data, you can break it down according to the different panels in the figure. Okay, so we have now gone through the different components, the where and the what that you should find in a results section. And so next, what you should do is go back to Canvas, and there should be a check understanding quiz that you need to take where you can essentially apply everything we just talked about to a new results section for you, so you can pull out these different pieces of information on your own, and that will prepare you for the next assignment where we're then going to have you practice writing some of these results on your own, using some of that fish egg data that you worked with in the ANOVA week. So thanks for talking about snails and fish eggs with me, and now go to Canvas and take that check understanding quiz.